All right, Rich, you're going to tell me a funny story about Mind's Eye Theater.
Absolutely. So very early in my tenure at White Wolf, I was invited to come to a convention in Kansas City, Missouri called SeanCon. And as part of that, they were doing a vampire LARP, and they asked me to guest star in the vampire LARP. Now, being brand new on the job, I was terrified of messing up. So I immediately went scrambling for all the Mind's Eye Theater books so I could know everything and not mess up. And I could bring the books with me so I could have them for reference. And I learned as I did that half the books were out of print and that they contradicted one another, and that I actually had to go diving into like barrels of discarded stuff in our warehouse to find a couple of them, and it was just crazy. And I show up in Kansas City and I've got 6 books tucked under my arm like this, and by the end of that night my shoulder was pretty much not speaking to me anymore, and I'm like, there's got to be a better way. And I said, okay, what we need is a pocket guide with all the rules that actually work together, that looks like a prop, so that people can carry it around at game, and it's not going to be an instant breaker of disbelief, of suspension of disbelief. And I bounced that off the folks who ran the Kansas City game. They're like, oh God, yes, please take my money. And so I went back to White Wolf, and I already had my schedule filled out for that year, what books I was going to do. And I said, hey, we really need to do this one. They're like, well, the schedule's full. I'm like, look, you don't understand. It won't cost anything. We will need no art, except for maybe a couple of chapter heading photos. We will need no new writing. It's already there. I just need to organize it. And there is demand. And they're like, no, because the last couple of Mind's Eye books had not done great, and they weren't really sure what to do with it. I'm like, please trust me, I'll do it for free. I'm like, okay. So I went looking for all the files for Mind's Eye Theater, and some were easy to find and some were not, and some were on a floppy drive labeled White Wolf Beer, because at one point market apparently wanted to start a microbrewery or something. I don't know. And so I put them all together, and I'm like, okay, these don't work with these, and rewrote the whole thing, and haunted the local vampire larps to just sort of grab players who were taking breaks saying, hey, what do you think of this? And lo and behold, we actually got Laws of the Night out of that. And then they told me, okay, great, we'll do it. We'll do a print run of 4,000. I'm like, oh God, no, we're going to need more. We're going to need more. And I literally begged our print buyer to up the print run. And he was kind enough to up it to 5,000. And it went out, and it sold out in like days. And I started getting phone calls at work in my office from store owners saying, hey, could we buy your personal copy from you, because we're out and we need one? Like, no, mine. But the other funny thing is that you can tell which printing of the early first edition of Laws and Island by which typos are on the cover. So the first one says, even in the night there are laws. And then the second one had another typo. On the third one, they'd screwed up the alignment on the silver ink for the cover. So the first three all have mistakes, and then they finally got it straightened out.
That's
But
so funny. I forgot until you started telling that story that like I had the original one that was like the
mm-hmm,
full-size book and the companion, which I
mm-hmm,
still remember the advice for costuming yourself as a Nosferatu, which was like to make a mask out of a milk jug or something like that.
yeah,
But yeah, remembering when the digest sized ones came out, like I have a friend who's a board game designer, and
mm-hmm,
he tells a story about being at Gen Con, and someone on a panel is like talking about chutes and ladders and saying like, yeah, we made the last space rainbow colored because it used to be just purple and you could only finish the game if you pulled purple, and so now it's rainbow colors, so you can finish the game with any color. And a guy said, you're the guy responsible for making it so the game could end. He was a dad. And the
mm-hmm.
game designer was like, yeah. And the dad stood up and started clapping, and everybody else did too. And I had the same feeling when you said, yeah. So we made a pocket digest size because I remember just having the digest one in my little satchel. Uh, of course, it was a different time. It was the 90s, and I was like 16, and they were
Mm-hmm.
like letting me play with grown-ups that I don't think would happen today. But still a
Possibly
really
not.
good time. Well, this is the Jaunty Mantis, a podcast of creative questions for curious gamers. And tonight I have the very, very great pleasure to sit down with Richard Dansky, the acclaimed game writer and one of the key voices behind Wraith the Oblivion, the Mind's Eye Theater live action rules for Vampire the Masquerade, and the broader World of Darkness line. We're going to explore his personal history with tabletop, role playing, the creative roots of Gothic storytelling, and the cultural impact of decades spent building unforgettable worlds. And before we jump into that, Rich, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. And do you have anything you're working on or you want people to go buy? Because with the algorithm, people are listening to the first 5 minutes. So I want you to get it in there if you got something to plug.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you for having me on. My most recent project was the Video Game Writer's Guide to Surviving an Industry That Hates You, which is a practical survival guide for anybody who wants to be a video game writer. And I've got a bunch of upcoming projects, including a novel called Nightmare Logic and a short story collection called Letters to the Dead, and they'll be out next year. And I'm also doing my first graphic novel, which is called Bridgewater, and will be published in French, actually.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Thank you.
How's the graphic novel writing process? Does that differ a lot from what you've done traditionally, or?
It's incredibly different, but it's a ton of fun. The trick to writing graphic novels is that you cannot write action. You are writing a series of frozen tableaus that must communicate the action, but without motion. And so that was a hard thing to wrap my head around. Fortunately, I have a wonderfully talented and experienced co-author on this project, a gentleman named Alexis Noland, who writes under the pen name of Mats. He's very well known in France. His graphic novel series, The Killer, actually got turned into a movie by David Fincher a couple years back. And
Oh, wow.
so, yeah, he and I have been friends for a long time. And he brought me on board to do this project with him. And he has been an immeasurable help and a wonderful mentor in trying this medium for the first time.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. Well, I'll keep an eye out for that. Is there going to be an English version too, or just in French?
I really hope it'll be in English. But if there isn't and you buy the French one, let me know. I'll send you the English script.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, we are in our oral history season, and I just got distracted, started reading the titles on the shelf behind you. Heart. Is that Heart in there in red?
Which
Like second shelf up?
these are actually records.
Oh, okay.
Yes, this is my grandfather's record collection.
There's one that the spine looks just like Heart, but the role-playing game by Rowan Rook and Deckard. But now that you say it's a record, okay.
These are records going back to 1915. So
Oh, cool.
yeah, my grandfather was a very musical fellow, and it was a honor and a pleasure to inherit his collection.
Nice. My dad is a musician, actually, a jazz drummer. So
Cool.
amongst other things. So
Yeah.
cool. All right. Well, speaking of backgrounds, for the oral history season, my first question for you is, can you tell me a little bit about where you grew up and what your early life was like?
Sure. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. And when I was just about 5 years old, my family moved to suburban Philadelphia because my father was working for a company in Philadelphia. And I attended public school there. And yeah, I was a voracious reader from the get-go, though I didn't start reading fiction until third grade when I had this infamous bout of chickenpox, and my mother took all my books on dinosaurs out of my room and replaced them with first the Chronicles of Narnia and then Ray Bradbury's The Halloween Tree. So that was a turning point in my life there. But my parents were very supportive. They wanted me to try anything I set my mind to. They supported me in doing that. They really wanted me to be creative. My toys were Legos and Lincoln Logs and Tinker Toys and Capsellas. They wanted me to build stuff and be creative. And they encouraged me when I developed an interest in making my own games to start doing that. They gave me this giant slab of Formica that was left over from redecorating our kitchen. And I, of course, drew a grid on it because I didn't realize hexes were better. I was 9, I don't know. And started making up my own games with that slab of Formica as my board. And my mother thought this was great. And when I got into role playing games, she was actually incredibly supportive of that because she thought it was great that I was being creative and I had friends would be creative with me. So whenever she was out shopping and she saw something role playing related, she would buy it for me and bring it home, which meant I had this incredible hodgepodge of totally mismatched role playing supplements. There was some RuneQuest and some James Bond and some Dungeons and Dragons, of course. I still have my original blue box with the dragon on the cover, and just all sorts of bits and bobs. And I read them all and devoured them all. And eventually, when I started playing, I found my group of like-minded miscreants, because you always find that. And we did the D&D thing for a while, and then we sort of branched over to some of the more specialized, I guess, rule systems. So we did a bunch of Villains and Vigilantes, and we did a lot of the Chaosium games, particularly Stormbringer. We had a long-running Stormbringer campaign.
Oh, wow.
I am very proud of the fact that my character, who was not a sorcerer, actually survived to the end of it.
That's impressive for Stormbringer. Any
Yes.
Chaosium game, actually. I've just as an aside, I've been listening to a couple. I'll shout them out. Audience of the Mantis out there, as you know, I really like the Grognard Files and What Would the Smart Party Do, two British podcasts, and they talk about their formative play experiences, which includes some D&D, but is a lot more Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest. And it's
Mhm.
like hearing about that is like this whole other evolutionary line of the hobby that like just grown up in the era that I did in the States when your primary source was like B. Dalton or a comic book store. It
Mhm.
was either D&D, some Battletech technical manuals, or riffs at the comic book
Mhm.
store. So until, sometime in the early 90s, I found a copy of Werewolf or first edition in a Nebraska game store, and my life
Mhm.
was inevitably darkened and goth and cooler as a result. Um, how old were you when you first became aware of role-playing games?
I was in middle school, and my mom had bought me the blue box, and I started reading it. And I had a friend, gentleman named Frank Rotman, who I am lucky enough to still be in contact with today, who was, ahead of the curve on that stuff. And so he sort of pointed me at the really cool stuff, and I dove in and devoured. And he was the one who also pointed me at Call of Cthulhu when we got to high school. And yeah, it was this glorious discovery of all of these books. And I read everything cover to cover, because at that point I really didn't have anybody to play with. But on one hand, that meant, I knew all the stats for carrying crawlers and gelatinous cubes. On the other hand, it meant that I knew all the stats for carrying crawlers and gelatinous cubes.
I had a joke when I moved to Chicago in the early 2000s. It's just like, when I was a teenager, no one wanted to know how many hit dice an ogre has. And then for some reason in the early 2000s in Chicago, knowing how many hit dice an ogre has could get you somebody's phone number. So it was a very strange change in the world. Um, did you have any other interests and hobbies growing up before RPGs? I know you said you were a voracious reader. Was there anything else that you really enjoyed spending time with? Board game design, I guess you were
Yes.
board gaming as well.
Absolutely. I was, of course, a dinosaur fanatic, and I also loved rocks and minerals. I played clarinet, and then in high school branched out to saxophone as well. And so that took up a lot of my time. And I was very lucky in that the school district I attended had a program for apprenticeship to various members of the community. And I was apprenticed to a couple of scientists doing frontline research at Thomas Jefferson University and then Fox Chase Cancer Research Center. So starting in eighth grade or so, after school, I would trundle off downtown to Thomas Jefferson University in the heart of Philadelphia and work in a lab doing world original research. And
Oh,
it was
wow.
amazing and cool, and led to a moment where I dunked my hand into a vat of liquid nitrogen a few times because I had been left unsupervised and it was late. But well, that's another story. But really, I had this incredible experience of doing world original research with scientists and learning so much from that and getting that experience. And that was absolutely a ton of fun. But I completely overloaded myself in high school. I would do, classwork, and I was on the newspaper, and I was doing this research, and I was in the band and the orchestra and the marching band, and I did some theater and was playing D&D or, Call of Cthulhu, whatever, with my friends. And okay, I didn't date a lot, but I think that was a given at that point.
Yeah, I think I might be a generation behind you, but yeah, the hobbies themselves tended to preclude girlfriends a lot of the time, but that's fine. That's fine. The kids today are so lucky because, like, everybody plays D&D together or plays
Yeah.
RPGs together. It's great.
Yeah, no, that makes me so damn happy. And honestly, it wasn't that my group of friends was ew girls. It was just that we were very intent on what we were doing, and that was how it went.
Yep. Um, do you remember what was your first experience as a player in a tabletop role-playing game? Do you remember?
It was Dungeons and Dragons, and it was, of course, B2, Keep on the Borderlands.
Excellent. I just talked my brother-in-law into buying the new 5e starter set because he
Mm-hmm.
has a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old that he wants to teach D&D, and I'm just like,
Mm-hmm.
dude, you got to get this one. It's Keep on the Borderlands. I mean, updated. So,
Nice.
and I'm not going to necessarily be like, oh, well, you got that age, you should play vampire with him. Probably not some good advice.
No, 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 no.
Who were you with when you played your first game?
Um, I want to say it was one of my friends back in the day, a kid named Jason Fisher. And I know very quickly I found a group of folks in high school that I played with for a while, and then I sort of settled into my really core group, and we played everything together. We would have these long nights. We go over to this one guy's house, guy named Morgan Neck, and his parents' house had this huge side room basically. So we would set up and we'd role play for a while, and then we'd order pizza, and then we'd role play for a bunch longer, and then we'd order Chinese food, and then we'd role play for a bunch longer. By then it was like 3 in the morning, and we'd go to sleep for a couple hours and get up and role play some more.
Yeah, it's I feel like that's always there's that urge to try and recapture that experience, which is just impossible to do as an
Yeah.
adult. But I actually one time we had like a weekend where all the guys
Mhm.
got together and my friend's wife was out of town and we had a weekend sleepover at his house where we tried to game. Like we were still teenagers and we didn't make it far because we're old farts, but it was pretty fun.
I
Um,
can believe that.
what drew you in and kept you coming back to the RPGs?
It was the storytelling, honestly. I always was a bit of a storyteller, but I really didn't sort of focus myself as a writer for a while. And this was kind of key in figuring out how to do that in telling stories with my friends and making the stuff as we went along up as we went along. And also just the fact that we were doing something together. And this was, a thing that we could all do. And we'd sort of outgrown the ride our bikes together down the creek and go get go get an ice cream, whatever. But this was something we were all doing together and we were making something together. And that was really cool.
Yeah, cool. Do you remember what your first character was like? I don't remember what the first character I ever played in an RPG is like, so this is a tricky question, but
I want to say it was a dwarven cleric.
okay.
And I am pretty sure that his incantation for doing healing prayers was gold, 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 gold.
Wonderful. Uh, and how did your involvement with TTRPGs change over time? So you start with Keep in the Borderlands, high school era, you're playing more Call of Cthulhu. What happens next?
Well, I got to college and I was suddenly immersed in this incredible sea of cool, creative, fun people, and I wanted to be friends with everybody. So I said, "Hey, I'm going to run a role playing game. You want to play? You want to play? You want to play? You want to play?" And a lot of these folks had never played a role playing game, and the easiest game to get them in on was Villains and Vigilantes, because the character generation was you make your own, you stat up yourself, and then you add superpowers. And so
Okay.
I had a Villains Vigilantes game that had like 23 players in it, and occasionally they would all show up, which made rolling for initiative kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
But it was just this glorious game that ran for 4 years while I was in college. And at the same time, I got into LARPing. Uh, Shortly after I got onto campus, I got sucked into Wesleyan University's LARP crowd, and that led to me running around the woods of northeastern Connecticut trying to beat holy hell out of my closest friends with plumbing supplies, and one particularly awkward moment where I jumped into a body of water while in fact wearing chainmail.
Oh no.
That did not go well. That did not go well at all.
Well, you
Uh,
lived, so
I did, And then I would go back home, and for the summer, I'd be working with a couple of my friends who did role playing, specifically the guy Morgan again, and we sort of graduated to Vampire. One day, Morgan's like, "Oh, I found this cool new game. We need to try this."
Was that
Uh,
first edition? Was
yes,
that really early in its run?
this was paperback, yeah,
Okay.
and we did that, and mind's blown. And it all became this sort of whirlwind of role playing stuff. I was running Villains Vigilantes, and I was in this LARP group. We actually split off from the group that we were with at Wesleyan and founded our own group that lasted for 20 years. That was just a ton of fun to work with, and we would have these amazing weekend long games. And back home, I'd be playing with my old crowd, and I had other friends on campus that I was playing in a D&D campaign with, and it was all great. It was all this total mishmash of being in the role playing space.
Yeah, just getting to spend all the time making stories and being in other worlds.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
I have
miss
to say
that.
that, yeah, the LARP stuff was incredibly valuable to me later on when I went to White Wolf. We would, like I said, rent out this camp in it was the Wyndham Tullen 4-H camp in northeastern Connecticut, which had cabins and a couple of lakes and trails and awesome space. And we would have these massive games with dozens of people and dozens of NPCs, and we'd build these incredibly complicated props. And this was, again, back in the 80s and 90s, we started doing this.
Hmm.
But we had a dragon that was built onto a motorcycle, which was probably incredibly unsafe in hindsight, but it was awesome. And we had all these amazing things that everybody threw themselves into, and it was a ton of fun. And it also taught me a lot of lessons about how to tell stories for lots of different people and how to tell stories in an interactive space where the important thing is, what does the player want to do? And that ended up informing all of my game design stuff and all of my game writing, whether tabletop or video games going forward.
Awesome. Did how did the I know you said early on you played Call of Cthulhu and then you found Vampire like right after college or end of college
During
time
college.
during college. And how did you gravitate more into the horror aspects of TTRPGs, or had that always been a strong theme or element of the stories you like to tell or characters you like to play?
I started with horror in third grade with Bradbury and the Halloween Tree. And it was this weird relationship for a while because I would have terrible nightmares as a kid. But it was always fascinating to me. And from Bradbury, then I went to Lovecraft, and then I went through from Lovecraft to Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen and M.R. James. And from there, it all exploded. And so I was awash in horror pretty much once I got to high school, really, and much more even when I got to college. And I even did my undergraduate thesis on Lovecraft. And so playing Call of Cthulhu was a natural, because back in the day there was the series of paperbacks with that Michael Whelan cover, Lovecraft's Nightmare. They had the big illustration that was wrap around on the giant compilation volume, and then they had the smaller volumes with just like sections of that. And I don't know if you remember that picture or not, but it was this black and white and gray thing with red highlights, and it was just shocking and mind blowing. And everybody thought it was the coolest thing ever. And so, of course, we all scrambled to buy those books and went from there.
I think the Lovecraft collected works I have a painting that sounds very similar
Mm-hmm.
on the cover. That it's pretty weird
Yeah,
image.
it's called Lovecraft's Nightmare. If it's not on your book, look it up and bow down before the genius that is Michael Whalen.
Okay. Um, were you incorporating horror elements in your Villains and Vigilantes, which is ostensibly a superhero game?
A very little bit. I mean, it was all our friends getting together, so it was mostly wacky and silly and fun. And we were blowing up large portions of the campus that we were attending. And at one point, the heroes decided they didn't want to save the world, so they wanted to go to Disney World. So of course, I turned Captain EO into a death trap, and yeah, that's about the level of the room on that stuff. That wasn't really
Okay.
horror, but it was an exercise in storytelling for large groups of people. And also, this was a bunch of really, really smart people. So I would plan stuff out and they would totally sideswipe me. And I'd have to think on my feet like nobody's business to keep the plot rolling and make it seem like, no, no, I anticipated that. And they only stopped me dead in my tracks once. But I vowed this would never happen again. It was light, it was silly, it was fun, but at the same time, it was incredibly good training for what was to come.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you transition into writing professionally for tabletop role-playing games?
Well, I knew Jen Hartshorn from our time together at Wesleyan, and she went down to White Wolf to work on Wraith while I was up in Boston doing my graduate work at Boston College and then working in the city for a little while after. And I was running a massive vampire campaign through grad school and after. And she knew that I wanted to write and that I'd sort of gotten knocked out of the box on my personal writing while I was at Wesleyan through a very unfortunate encounter with a writer named Annie Dillard. And she came to me, and I will always be grateful to her for this, and said, "Hey, I need some writing for a book I'm doing for Wraith. It's called Haunts. I just need a setting and some characters. Could you do 2 chapters? I know this is something you want to do." And I went, "I don't, yes, please." And then I sat down and I realized I had no idea how to do this. And I was banging my head against the wall. And in those days, I was attending Boston College as a graduate student. And I was also working 2 jobs, one of which was as a teacher for the Princeton Review. And I have no idea if they're still in business, but back in the day, they did standardized test prep. They teach you the tricks to beat the SAT and the GRE and the GMAT and the GRE and all the other acronyms that you could think of. And I was teaching SAT prep in suburban Boston at the time. And the classroom that they had rented for me was the basement of this church that had no air conditioning and had furniture that was designed for 8-year-olds. So I'm trying to teach bored, sweaty high school students how to do math tricks in a room that is designed for the Lollipop Guild. And one day when I was proctoring a fake test for them, because we had to give them fake tests every so often to see their progress, I sat down and said, "Okay, I've got to do this. What if it was a casino full of dead people? And what if it was a Lovecraft mansion?" And that was the spark. And I sat down in that tiny, tiny chair at that tiny, tiny desk in that very warm room and started scribbling. And that was the origin. I think I did the Hanging Gardens Casino first, and then the Tillinghast Mansion for Haunts. And I think I overrode both of them by 2,000 words apiece. And Jen liked them, and then I got hired to do some stuff for the Wraith Player's Guide, including the opening fiction, which was really my first piece of fiction that had ever been published. And
What a
from there,
start.
yeah, thanks. And it just took off from there. From there, I did more Wraith, and I did some stuff on the original Changeling, the Dreaming, the opening sequence with the items on the desk, and the tarot reading made of business cards. That was something that I wrote, and it was actually kind of funny because I wrote it um, while I was desperately ill with bronchitis verging on pneumonia. And at that point, I was working for an outplacement firm on Newbury Street, and I had borrowed their fax machine so I could send the pages down to Atlanta. And so I was literally just staggering across the kitchen, feeding pages into the fax machine to get them to Ian Lemke, who was the Changeling developer, on time.
Oh, wow. That's some dedication.
Well, I was really excited about that, and also, this was professional writing, and I was not going to mess it up.
Yeah, yeah. I was looking like on your website. I think your publication list. I suspect and don't know. You might be the most, at least in the material you created, the most goth of the writers for White Wolf, just because of the focus. So, congrats. That's I
Thank
mean
you,
that as a compliment.
thank you, thank you.
Um, what as you were what drew you to Wraith so much? Because I know, I mean, obviously I've got that 20th anniversary book behind me on the shelf, which you may have been involved with.
To quote the film Gettysburg, we were involved. Yeah, but so Jen moved over to Vampire when Andrew Greenberg left, and that created an opening for Wraith, and she proposed me for the job. And much to my surprise, they hired me, and I moved down to Atlanta to take over Wraith and Mind's Eye Theater at the same time. And I loved ghost stories. I love ghost stories, and I loved Wraith from the get-go because of the concept of the world, and because honestly, in my opinion, it was the only one of the Worlds of Darkness games that had hope. It's a little tiny dim sliver of light at the end of the tunnel, but there's actual hope. And I love the way the original design incorporated character building into the mechanics, so that the stuff that made your character who they were was incorporated into the rule set and the play through the passions and fetters. And I of course love the shadow mechanic. And I looked at the setting with the real world, and then Stygia, and then the far shores, all the possibilities, and I was just thrilled to get my hands on it because I saw all the possibilities, and I wanted to dive right in. And I was just very lucky in that I'd already, even before I took this on, I was contracted to write the first of the guild books, Artificers. So that was the perfect place to sort of kick off the meta plot that I wanted to do for Wraith, and create a continuing arc that would run through all the guild books, a continuing piece of fiction, and also use that to really frame the world in terms of what do people do in this place to give players better ideas. But I loved Wraith in that it could do anything. You could do local, personal, deeply disturbing psychological horror. You could do the uplifting, affirming stuff like in Ghost, where you're resolving the stuff that you left unfinished. You could do action adventure. You could do cosmic horror, cruising through the Tempest. You could do political games like Vampire, because those Elder Wraiths and Stygia, they were not going anywhere. And you could explore and do high fantasy going off to the far shores. Just there was so much possibility there, and I was like a kid in a candy store.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, Wraith, of all the original White Wolf lines, Wraith is, I think, I love them all, but Wraith is
Mhm.
my absolute favorite, and it's sadly the one I've never gotten to play. And the more time I just spend circling obliquely around that book, I'm just like, but it's not hard. Like what you do in the game is really clearly communicated by it. So someday I'm getting that on my table.
Okay, what you need to do, if you're on Facebook, join the Wraith the Oblivion Facebook group, because it's full of people looking for players for online games.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm writing it down.
Okay. Yeah, but it was funny because I would go to conventions and I'd have people walk up and say, "I love Wraith, but I can't find anybody to play with," and they'd walk away. And then 5 minutes later, "I love Wraith, but I can't find anybody to play with." I'm like, "Okay, I'm duct taping you to a chair and waiting for the next person to come along." And but no, I understand why it was hard for people to find groups, because it asks a lot of players, it asks a lot of trust, most importantly with the shadow dynamic and with harrowings, and it
For
can
the
get
listeners who can you briefly describe both of those things for listeners who may not be familiar with it?
absolutely. So in Wraith, the shadow is the, for lack of a better way of putting it, the dark side of your personality. And in a classic Wraith game, you play your main character, but somebody else in the group plays your shadow. And at various points during the gameplay, they will whisper things in your ear. They will offer you dice that might be booby trapped to help you out of dangerous situations. They will use their powers to try and put you in a bad position. And if things get really bad, they will take over and do all sorts of bad stuff in your body. And so that's a really interesting mechanic when it's done well, and you can have some fantastic role playing interplay between someone who's playing the character and their shadow. And it's really, really cool when it works well, but also requires a lot of trust in that you're sharing your character sheet with another player and you have to trust them not to take advantage. And also, that sort of shadow play can get into some serious trust issues. And then harrowings, Wraith, unlike most games, when you run out of hit points or the equivalent, you don't just die. You go into what's called a harrowing, which is essentially a psychodrama that you must role play your way out of. And that psychodrama is put together by the other players, specifically the player playing your shadow, taking lead, and it's built around one of your character aspects, one of the things that's driving your character. And so you must role play your way out of this incredibly twisted, horrific psychodrama to recover and return to where you were and who you were. But again, that's a place that can get really intense really fast if you have really good role players. And that's something that somebody just wants a beer and pretzels game probably isn't going to want to commit to. And there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with just wanting a beer and pretzels game. But if you're going to play Wraith, it's a go big or go home kind of deal, really.
Yeah, that was always a selling point to me, and I think it's just, it's just finding the bravery to do that, trust. I think, like, I have this group of guys I play with, and you mentioned still being in touch with one of those people you first played games with. Like, two of the people I played in middle school with, I'm still friends with.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a regular Sunday night game, and it's all white dudes in their 40s. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain demographic that we sort of test as.
Yeah.
And like one night, our someone couldn't make it and game fell through. And my brother-in-law was like, "Hey, I just bought this game. Alice is Missing. Are you familiar with
Mm-hmm.
Alice is Missing?"
Yes.
For the listeners, is Missing is a game played only by text that centers around the disappearance, possibly abduction or murder of a teenage girl, and you're all her friends or family members looking for her and then just communicating with each other. And I had so many hesitations about playing that game with a group of white guys in our 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And they did amazing. And I was like, I think I could play Wraith with these guys. So I think someday I might get that on the table for them.
Okay, cool. Well, best of luck with that.
Thank
And
you.
I hope it goes well. And if you need any storytelling pointers, you know where to find me.
Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate it. I think I saw you telling a story in the Wraith group
Mm-hmm.
on Facebook, and I was like, I'll just take the swing and reach out to Richard and see if he wants
Mm-hmm.
to come on. So again, thanks.
Sure.
Um, are there any in character moments you've had as a player? Sorry, I'm switching gears pretty dramatically
No,
on
no,
you.
all good, all good.
Are there any in character moments, yours or others in games you've played that stand out as especially powerful? And then, sub question, what is the most, oh my God, we're going to jail moment you've had at a LARP?
Oh boy, oh boy. Um, let's see. Well, powerful moments. Yeah, I've been gaming since the early '80s, so I've seen some really cool stuff and some really wacky stuff along the way. And there have been really emotional moments. I'll tell two stories from honestly from when we were putting together Wraith the Oblivion second edition. One, we were running a playtest session at work, and it was some of my coworkers and one of our interns, and we were set up in the conference room. And to make it especially spooky, I'd lit a couple candles. This was before I set my desk on fire, but that's another story. Um, but we were doing this, and one of the layout artists, a guy named Rob Dixon, his nickname was Shaggy because he looked like Shaggy from Scooby Doo, came in and said, "Hey, can I just sit in and watch for a while?" And we said, "Sure." And so he sat down and watched us play for a while. And it was a great group. And Charlie Bates was playing a disguised specter and a wraith who'd gone over the dark side. And so he was doing all his deviltry exceptionally well. And it was spooky and tense and awesome. And after about, I'd say, half an hour, Shaggy got up and said, "This is too much to me. I got to go." So that was an impactful moment. But in that same game, we did a series of harrowings that were essentially Inception before Inception. So by the time the character escaped from this series of nested psychodramas, neither they nor the player knew which was the game and which was the harrowing anymore. And
Yeah,
so that was a totally cool topsy turvy moment there.
that's
And
awesome.
yeah, those are ones that I story told. And I had a blast storytelling my vampire game in Boston during graduate school, and just it was so fun and memorable, and the group was so great. We literally had a quote board that's like 8 pages long. And at one point, one of my friends who was working a fairly high powered job at the time told his boss, "Look, I know we got a project going. If you need me Sunday night, call me." And he had already told his boss about the vampire game. She says, "No, by the time I need you, you'll be off sucking somebody's blood."
Well, it's good to have a supportive boss, I guess, with that kind of
Absolutely.
hobby. That's really great. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Do you have a most we're going to jail moment from a LARP? If it is,
the
refer to
what?
the dragon on the motorcycle. That's okay.
No, no, no. That was off in the woods. Nobody saw that but us. But I will say there was one time, one of those LARPs, I was dressed up like Frankenstein's monster. Don't ask why. But I had green makeup on and I had two votive candle holders duct taped to the side of my neck, and I was in costume, whatever. And we were at this 4-H camp in the middle of nowhere, Connecticut. And one of the folks was coming to the game, called and said, "We're lost. We don't know how to find the camp." And I said, "I'll go. I know where they are. I know that store. They're at a convenience store. I will go get them. I'll be back with them in half an hour." And so I go out and I roll up to this convenience store in rural Connecticut, which is still rural. And I walk into the convenience store dressed like Frankenstein. Heads exploded.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, middle.
we got out of there in a hurry.
That's fantastic. Um, I'd like to talk about community and identity a little bit, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
What kinds of gaming communities have you gotten to be a part of over the years?
I have been so lucky in that I've been a part of so many communities in multiple different roles. As a player, as a GM, as a founder of a group like with Quest, the LARP group, as a professional where I was able to reach out and support players. And all of those interactions have been incredibly valuable and incredibly rewarding. And I love the fact that the gaming community has grown and grown and grown, and in so many ways become more inclusive and broader, and done so much more over the years. And that I've been able to watch that happen as part of it. And that hopefully, even some of what I've done has maybe in a tiny way helped that along. And so, in terms of community, I remember going to my first Origins, and it was somebody was giving a speech and cracking about how, gosh darn it, there's girls here now. And what's wrong with you? And here we are in the world of thirsty sword lesbians, and that is awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
And I am nothing but thrilled that the hobby has moved to that place, and that it's going to keep moving to new and more exciting places. And in terms of the communities I've been a part of, it's been some of the best relationships and some of the best social moments I've had in my life. There's when you build a world together with someone, when you share imagination with someone, you can really go to a special place with them, and it can be incredibly rewarding. And if you're welcoming and they're welcoming, and you're all doing this together, it can be magic.
yeah, yeah. I 100% agree. It's that, like, I did Gen Con this year,
Hmm.
and it wasn't my first Gen Con, but this time I was like, I'm going in like
Hmm.
I'm not scared enough of the pandemic now. Finally, I'm gonna go in
Hmm.
like totally arms open, and just the overwhelming impression that was driven home yet again is just how overwhelmingly kind and accepting the people in our community generally are, in face to face when we're not necessarily on Reddit groups. So
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
and
I
it's
mean,
it's
yeah, there's folks out there who are possessive of the hobby and who are afraid that it's being taken away from them. And I think there's no need for that, and there's no place for that. And I resolutely stand against people who will try and wall off the hobby from other people, who will act aggressively, who will be negative and hateful and hurtful. This is
Mhm.
this is a place where we can all come together and create something together, and there should be no walls and no boundaries.
I agree. Actually, I will just say the editorial stance of the Jaunty Mantis also agrees as well. And since I get to decide what the editorial stance is, no problem there. Um,
Okay.
so I guess here's the big one then. What role have tabletop games played in your life overall?
They have been one of the most important things things in my life. Full stop. They gave me an outlet for creativity when I was growing up. They gave me a way to make friends and have a social group of guys I loved and loved hanging out with. At that time, they let me talk to new people in college. They gave me new experiences. They were my first real profession, and they became my calling. And here I am, 30 years into a career as a professional in the game space, tabletop and LARP and video. And now I'm even working on a card game with my girlfriend called Squatches and Scotches. So there's
Oh, cool.
another mountain to climb. But in a very real way, tabletop has done a ton to sculpt who I am and to lay out my path before me. And if the road that I'm on was laid out initially by Ray Bradbury and uh, Lloyd Alexander with the Chronicles of Prydain and Tolkien, um, the uh, the second lane was added by tabletop role playing games.
Excellent. Uh, you mentioned, I kind of wondered, okay, I'll save that for the end question. Um, if someone were to tell this, if this retreads that question a little bit, like it's okay, we can skip this one, but if someone were to tell the story of your gaming life, what would you want them to most understand?
I think the thing I'd want them to most understand is that whatever I did, I wanted people to get something out of it. And whether that was my play, giving other players something to bounce off of and do their own shtick, my GMing being welcoming and letting people explore and have fun and try something different and have a safe space to do cool stuff in when maybe the real world was grim and tight and you know getting them down. My work hopefully inspired people and let them go places that maybe they hadn't given themselves permission to go on their own. And I will say, when the time came to do Wraith 20, um, it got announced, and I got this overwhelming barrage of messages from folks talking about how important Wraith had been to them and how it had given them a safe space to figure some things out about themselves, how they've been able to try stuff in that place that they couldn't in the real world, and how important it was to them, and stuff that was even heavier than that. And I certainly don't claim all the credit for Wraith Gin, and the folks who created it did an amazing job. And then I was lucky in a position where I could do something more with it. But I like to think that the stuff that I did was important to people. And I've been told it was important to people and that it gave them something that they value to this day. And the fact that there's still, a Wraith group and folks who still love the game tells me that, me and all the folks I worked with, we did something right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's got that role in my life too, even though I haven't got to, play it, but the time I've spent making characters, the lonely fun,
Mm-hmm.
and poring
Mm-hmm.
over that book and the way, like, even as I think a late teenager, it got me thinking about like, what would my fetters be? Like just as another tool to be introspective, not something I
Mm-hmm.
needed the most help with, but yeah. Yeah, I'm so grateful that that game's out there. I wonder, I don't know how widely read it is. I suspect pretty widely, but I wonder of all the storytelling games, I know a lot of them mention in the running the game section about that writer's room approach and that collaborative, but I think none of them are as direct as the instructions for running a harrowing about
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, right, no, you guys all get together and pick who you're going to be and what you're going to do about this. And I see so much of the influence of that style of play in the later story games that came out of like the Forge in the early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
and its influence I think is like I'm going to attribute it to in part to Wraith, but
Yeah, I will not complain if you do. And I hope you're right. And I hope what I did inspired people.
cool. What advice or thoughts would you share with someone just discovering TTRPGs?
Be brave with it. I know it can be a little scary to be somebody else for a while. I know there's a lot of numbers and a lot of dice can be opposing, but really, when you boil this hobby down, it's you're sitting there with some folks telling a story together, and then when you need to figure out whether something happens or not, you roll some dice, and that's all it comes down to. And so, let yourself have fun. Give yourself the permission to try and be someone else for a while and have that fun without worrying about, oh no, I need to put these points over here, or well, no, wait, this rule says I can only go this many feet. Don't worry about that. That's not what the game is about. It's there for you to be someone else for a little while, or to be someone who's a part of you for a little while with other people, and to do something great in that space before you have to go back to the real world with spreadsheets and tire rotations and God knows what else.
Yeah, that's my day job. I make artisanal spreadsheets, so I feel that one. All right. Well, then here's my bonus question that I was thinking of when you said Tolkien a minute ago, because that got me
Okay.
thinking. What an episode we did a while ago was one of our listeners asked us, "What would your guys' appendix in be?" And so, uh, and you said Tolkien, and I've long posited that like the Tolkien's influence on Dungeons and Dragons is very, very small. It's way more like Elric and like the Eternal Champion and other Moorcock stuff, I think, than other than that there's chests in troll holes occasionally in dwarves. So I guess my question is, what is your appendix in for Wraith 20?
Oh boy. The thing is, I outlined Wraith 20, and then we kept on knocking out stretch goals on the Kickstarter. I'm like, okay, we'll add this. Okay, we'll add this. Okay, we'll add Orpheus. Okay, we'll add the Book of Oblivion. And just, so Appendix N is already there and buried under several other appendices, I think.
Okay.
But if there were one thing that I would love to have tacked onto the end of it, it would be probably some more about the ferryman. I love the stuff that Jeff Grabowski did with them in Ends of Empire, and I thought they were an incredible storytelling element that didn't really come into play soon enough in Wraith's run. So, in hindsight, if I'd had 10,000 more words to play with, not that that book needed 10,000 more words, it clocked in at 330,000. It would have been probably about that.
It is of all my RPG books, and I have a considerable amount right next to Exalted Third Edition. It is the most likely that to be used as a murder weapon, which I think is ironic
It's
given
it's
the subject matter.
it's really appropriate, and then the book would probably levitate on its own and float down the hallway with
And then
post mortem energy.
and then the first edition would just float behind glowing with the nostrils and start like laughing and like some sepulchral tone, and then that'd be pretty cool. But yeah, the murder's bad. Okay. Well, thank you so much again for coming on the Jaunty Mantis. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and I hope you had a good time talking about just your journey through TTRPGs. And
It's
thanks.
been it's been great. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for asking some great questions. I hope what I said is amusing to your audience.
Uh,
And like I said, when you do run that Wraith game,
Okay, I will. I will. I'm actually gearing up Wednesday. I'm kicking off my first vampire campaign in like 15 years or so. So I was printing out character sheets and like planning what are we going to do on our session zero and getting super psyched and then kind of being like, could I switch to Wraith at the last minute? They're all so excited about vampire though. So it's
well,
torn.
what you do is you start the vampire campaign, and then a couple sessions in, when they're really attached to the characters, kill them off and turn them into wraiths. So it's just sort of what they call a backdoor pilot in TV
Yeah.
land.
Yeah, you just you heard it here. Best gaming advice from Richard Dansky on the Jaunty Mantis. All right. Well, thank you again, and until next time. Oh, I do have one more question.
Yes.
Who would you like to hear an oral history from in the RPG scene? Player, writer, designer.
Oh boy. There are some folks whose stories I love to hear, but I know those individuals actually prefer to keep their stuff pretty personal and private. But I think you would get a hell of a story out of Ken Hite.
Okay. I don't know him personally, but I know people who do. So
Ken is a glorious raconteur.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you again so much. And until next time, if you liked what you heard today on the Jaunty Mantis, please feel free to hit that like button or subscribe down below on the YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you heard your pod. Tell your friends; it really does help us out. And get out there and play some RPGs or something, or don't. Mantis out.